Freedom, openness, nobody cares. Stop trying to push Linux onto me if I can't even play my games. And honestly, fair enough. Linux gaming is not as good as Windows gaming. But there is a way to get basically everything working again, even if it's kind of cheating. Virtual machines. You can pass your actual real GPU to a real Windows install that you just use for Windows things, while having all the Linux stuff still on Linux. You don't need to reboot your computer, but it's two OSs on one drive, all backed up together. This is how you do it, but keep in mind there are some things to note. First, there is a performance loss. We're not sure yet whether that'll be by a terrible amount or barely noticeable, but we will find that out later in the video. And also, you can't plug in an extra USB device while Windows is running, like you normally could, unless you have an extra USB expansion card.
Convenient.
I'm not an expert, nor did I make the methodology. However, I've combined about 5 different guides online to get one that works for me. So if you have a problem with it or any suggestions, feel free to submit a pull request on GitHub. But while we wait for me to make that virtual machine, let's mention another detail. Windows 11. As you probably remember from the launch, Ryzen and Windows 11 performed terribly together, and there were Windows updates and AMD chipset drivers that ended up solving that. And for the native benchmarks, those are installed because that's how it should be. I can't install those chipset drivers on a virtual machine. And so, maybe the fact that we're virtualized under the Linux kernel fixes the problem and we don't have to worry about it, or maybe it just means there's a performance loss that we can't fix because it's a virtual machine. I'm not sure, it could be either until I actually get to see the benchmarks, but it's something important that may make a difference depending on whether you're on AMD or Intel. Oh. We're done. But before the benchmarks, I've got to be honest. I don't even own that many AAA games, and I'm not a benchmarking expert, so the first game I chose was CSGO. I used about 4 different CPU configs for the virtual machine, and whichever performs best will also try in a VR game. Then if both of those games have a similar performance loss, we can say that that's probably about the performance loss you'll get from gaming in a virtual machine. It's not super in-depth. I literally do not even own the games that I would need to properly actually test this with a bunch of different things. And CSGO and Beatsaber are pretty different games anyway, I hope. Anyway, the results. CSGO, max settings other than texture filtering set itself to trilinear and FXA is disabled, 1080p. Not having made many benchmark graphs before, when I saw the lows relative to the averages, I thought the VMs were performing really bad, but that's just actually how things are and I'm just unfamiliar. Compared to native, the best performing VM did 96% of native's average and was within 1 FPS of the lows. And the other results weren't even terrible either. The way the other results kind of are is one had 6 cores. I just gave it all of my cores and that performed the worst, presumably because Linux and Windows were fighting over that one core. Then there was a 4-core one with CPU pinning, which performed better than the 6-core, but worse than the 5-core, where just 1 core is left over for Linux out of my 6-core processor. So then let's try Beatsaber next. Because the game's frame rate is locked to the headset's refresh rate, we'll be using frame times instead, measured in milliseconds. Lower numbers, higher consistency is better. Beatsaber was running at default settings at 3664 by 1920 on the Quest 2 through ALVR, but do note, we're not going to have the same kind of graph as last time, because the tool I used to capture CSGO's performance was actually telling me that Beatsaber was always running really bad, like below 60 FPS, and that's just not true. So we'll be looking at the SteamVR performance graph for the same point in the song for native and virtualized. And if we look at 2 kind of common frame times and divide them together, it's about 96% again, most of the time. And I don't have any more benchmarks to show you because I just don't know how to use the tools well. I don't know how to make a good testing methodology that will work and I could keep using in future videos if I wanted. I'm not that good yet, so I will talk about the experience. Basically everything is just like those 2 games. You probably won't be able to tell by performance that you're virtualized. However, there are some usability differences. First, if you know from boot up that you just want to get into a Windows-only game, you still have to boot into Linux and then boot into Windows from the virtual machine. Also, the big one, anti-cheat. Sometimes it just doesn't work. A lot of games are just fine with it. But if you want to play Rainbow Six Siege, you just have no choice because BattlEye doesn't want you to. It's not like you can just go to turn Windows features on or off, enable Hyper-V, reboot, and then have significantly worse performance but also trick basically all anti-cheats other than Valorant's. It's just not an option. Also, we're just straight missing a core. Given the likely other reason you want a Windows virtual machine if you're not doing it for gaming is professional apps, and it's professional apps that normally take the best advantage of more cores, one less core might just be a deal breaker. For me though, Premiere works fine, and that's most of what I'm doing with the Adobe suite. As much as I want to spread Linux, this is impractical for most people. It performs well, and you don't have to reboot your computer to switch between OSs, it's all stored on one drive. It's really nice, and as an actual solution, once it's done, it works really well for me. But it can be a hassle to set up. There are conflicting guides about what matters and what doesn't, and differences in the hardware you've got, making your configuration different. It's a pain for most people to set up, and if you want Linux and Windows, you should probably dual boot, and even then, for most people, it's probably just better sticking with Windows until Linux actually does everything they need it to. But I'm passionate about technology, and it's just an interesting thing to try. And that's my argument. If you're watching this and you think it sounds interesting, you may as well try it. Linux is free. Hopefully you enjoyed. And subscribe if you'd like to.